My husband, George, was a successful lawyer. George's slippers were still by the bedside, untouched since the morning he collapsed. Losing him was like losing the foundation of my world. But before the grief could truly settle, the vultures arrived. 2 weeks after the funeral, my daughter-in-law, Shelley, and her mother, Pat, arrived from the city not with casseroles but with a sense of entitlement. They didn't just come to visit, they moved in. Their suitcases thudded against my wooden floors, the same floors George polished every spring. This wasn't just a house. This was where my son took his first steps, where George and I danced on our 25th anniversary. And now the silence was shattered by Shelley. She spoke loudly on the phone in the living room as if she already owned it, booking appointments and talking about selling points. The real invasion began when Shelley produced an old copy of George's will. It was outdated, written before my assets were separated, and they claimed it gave them the right to the house and a substantial chunk of George's retirement accounts. "You're grieving, Brenda," Shelley told me, her voice sickeningly sweet. "At your age, you shouldn't worry about all of these messy legal details. We can handle it." Pat kept giving Shelley those quiet, nudging glances, the kind only a mother uses when she's directing the puppet strings. They thought because I was 70 and heartbroken, I was mentally soft. They believed they could bully the simple, emotional widow into signing documents that would leave me broke and homeless. They talked over me as if I were furniture. I didn't correct them. Silence is its own form of strategy. Shelley waved the old will like it was a sword, convinced she held all the power. She didn't know the only real financial document that mattered wasn't on George's desk. It was in my own ledger. I had spent 20 years as a legal assistant, learning the hard truth that documentation is law. I vowed that the nightmare I saw in court for other widows would never happen to me. My methodical approach, the one George casually ignored, was now the weapon that would save my life. They walked into this house thinking they could take everything. They didn't know I was the one holding the real will of the law and of vengeance. Shelley and Pat's presence quickly made my house feel hostile. They searched through George's old office openly, looking for anything related to his finances. They were especially interested in his personal investment notes, a set of ambiguous documents George kept related to his major tax strategies. They knew just enough about George's risky financial history to be dangerous, but not enough to understand the full truth. While they ransacked George's study, I retreated to my small sewing room, which was always assumed to be filled with harmless fabrics. This room, however, was my real office. Behind a stack of ancient tax returns, I pulled out my lifeline, the shadow ledger. This wasn't a digital file George knew about. This was a series of bound notebooks, neatly labeled by year, detailing Shelley and Pat's presence quickly made my house feel hostile. They searched through George's old office openly, looking for anything related to his finances. They were especially interested in his personal investment notes, a set of ambiguous documents George kept related to his major tax strategies. They knew just enough about George's risky financial history to be dangerous, but not enough to understand the full truth. While they ransacked George's study, I retreated to my small sewing room, which was always assumed to be filled with harmless fabrics. This room, however, was my real office. Behind a stack of ancient tax returns, I pulled out my lifeline, the shadow ledger. This wasn't a digital file George knew about. This was a series of bound notebooks, neatly labeled by year, detailing every cent that moved through our household for 4 decades. I tracked every deposit, every withdrawal, every major payment, including every single check I wrote from my own savings toward the house mortgage, carefully noting the specific purpose. I started keeping the ledger after seeing too many legal nightmares at the law firm where I worked. Cases where wives were left destitute because the husband had handled all the finances and then died without proper documentation. I vowed that would never happen to me. My methodical approach, the one George casually ignored, was now the weapon that would save my life. The shadow ledger was pristine, unassailable, and detailed beyond measure. I realized Shelley wasn't just after money. She was after a specific vulnerability George had created. George was proud of using a complex tax loophole related to offshore investments, claiming it saved us millions. Shelley knew this loophole existed and assumed accessing it would make her rich. But George, in his arrogance, was often sloppy with the paperwork. He assumed his position as a lawyer was protection enough. As I reviewed the ledger, I confirmed my worst fear. George's scheme relied on perfect documentation, and I had the only copies that existed. If Shelley got those documents, she would become instantly rich. If I used them, I could expose George's tax evasion, a possibility I desperately wanted to avoid, both for George's memory and my own safety. The revenge had to be surgical, ruining Shelley without collapsing George's legacy. The true nature of Shelley's desperation became clear the morning she cornered me in the kitchen. She stopped pretending to be the sweet, grieving relative. "Brenda," she said, her voice sharp, "I know George had a detailed file on his offshore investments. I know it's here. I suggest you give it to us, or things will get very difficult for you." She and Pat were convinced the documents were somewhere in George's old office, but they were missing the key organizational link, George's personal notes, which I had safely archived. I played the confused widow. "Investments? Oh dear, I don't know anything about that, Shelley. George handled all the difficult things." My act was convincing because George had always ensured I was out of the loop on difficult things, believing my brain wasn't cut out for it. But that was a lie. I was the silent partner who made sure the T's were crossed and the I's were dotted. I realized Shelley needed George's specific, personal documentation, the documentation I held in my shadow ledger, to access the offshore accounts without triggering massive legal penalties. Without my files, the loophole was a time bomb. With my files, it was a gold mine. The stakes were enormous. I wasn't just protecting a house, I was protecting millions that George intended for our stable retirement, not Shelley's shopping sprees. To buy time, I gave Shelley a handful of old decoy files from George's desk. They were confusing and incomplete, enough to convince her she was getting close, but not enough to be useful. This distracted them for a few days, sending them into a frenzy of useless searching. While they were busy, I started contacting my own network. I didn't call George's former partners. That would alert them to the financial risk. I called a trusted lawyer I had assisted 20 years ago, Miss Hayes, who now specialized in asset protection. I didn't tell her the full story yet, not about the tax loophole, but I told her I had impeccable records proving the house was mine and that my daughter-in-law was attempting a financial takeover based on outdated documents. Miss Hayes' cautious interest told me I have found the right ally. The first step was completed. I had a plan, a clean lawyer, and a perfect decoy. Shelley and Pat quickly realized the decoy files I gave them were useless. The confusion turned into open hostility. The sweet act vanished completely. Pat, Shelley's mother, became the aggressor. She started trying to pressure me into signing documents, unverified legal agreements she claimed George had prepared years ago, giving her daughter access to our bank accounts. "It's what George would have wanted, Brenda," Pat said, pushing the pen toward me across the dining room table. "You look tired. Just sign it." I leaned back, playing the role of the frail widow who was too tired to argue. "Oh dear," I sighed. "I simply can't understand these complex legal documents. I need time to go over the clauses, Pat. Perhaps after my nap." This drove Pat into a rage. They couldn't understand why the old woman who couldn't remember where her own car keys were could suddenly cite the need to review clauses. My professional training was my shield. The pressure escalated when Shelley brought in a new lawyer, a flashy, inexperienced man named Mr. Finch, whom I recognized from the periphery of George's firm. Mr. Finch started sending threatening letters demanding I turn over all relevant financial documents. I recognized his documents immediately. They were crude forgeries based on outdated legal templates. Shelley was desperate and resorting to crime. I confirmed my suspicion when I cross-referenced the signature lines with my own files. George's signature was close, but the font and spacing were wrong. This was the opening I needed. I didn't send a letter to Mr. Finch. I sent a simple email to Miss Hayes, my new lawyer, attaching the letters and a small note. Miss Hayes, please file a motion to freeze George's retirement accounts immediately. These letters confirm fraud. I knew the freezing of the accounts would terrify Shelley and force her next move. The time for acting confused was over. The time for legal counterpunching was beginning. They had tried to steal my house. I was about to lock down their money. The moment George's retirement accounts were frozen, Shelley and Pat became truly unhinged. They stopped talking to me entirely, instead shouting at each other and pacing through the house, tearing apart George's office in search of the missing tax notes they needed to unfreeze the money. I let them search. It was a beautiful distraction. While they were destroying the house, I went to my secret weapon, the master file. This file was hidden inside a custom-built panel in the base of my sewing machine cabinet, a panel George, who always saw sewing as a frivolous female hobby, would never have noticed. The file contained two critical sets of documents: the house deeds and payments, pristine, categorized copies of every deposit, every mortgage payment, and every principal reduction I had made using my own separately earned funds, proving without question that the house was legally mine, regardless of the outdated will. The tax scheme documentation, the full definitive record of George's complex offshore tax loophole. This file included handwritten notes from George confirming his awareness of the risks, along with my own meticulously updated records, which prove that without this entire file, the whole scheme looked like deliberate illegal tax evasion. Holding the thin file, I realized the immense power I wielded. I could save George's professional memory by quietly ensuring this file vanished, or I could use the threat of its exposure to completely ruin Shelley and Pat and force them out of my life forever. The revenge had to be decisive. I chose to use the threat of the tax scheme documentation, the bomb, to ensure the immediate success of the house ownership documentation, the shield. I handed the shield, the house ownership proof, and the forged letters to Miss Hayes, giving her permission to fire the opening legal shot. I kept the bomb, the tax records, safe in my possession. With the retirement accounts frozen and Shelley's lawyer, Mr. Finch, unable to get them unfrozen without the missing tax notes, the battle lines were sharply drawn. Shelley and Pat grew desperate. They started talking openly about selling the house immediately, which was exactly what I didn't want. The house was mine, and I needed to keep it. I continued to play the slow, grieving widow, moving through the house quietly, letting them search and become exhausted by their own impatience. They were sure the key documents were in my safe. Shelley tried twice to pick the lock on my small safe in the guest room where I had placed a few decoy documents to distract her. She failed, of course, because she was a bully, not a professional criminal. While they were distracted, Miss Hayes executed my plan. She filed a legal motion for a declaratory judgment on asset ownership, based entirely on my shadow ledger and the documents in my master file. The filing claimed I had provided all the assets for the house and therefore had legal priority over the outdated will. Ms. Hayes also included the forged documents Shelley had sent, citing them as evidence of Shelley's predatory behavior against a grieving elderly widow. This legal move hit Shelley like a physical blow. She realized I wasn't just sitting there confused. I had been building a case, and my evidence was perfect. She tried to counter by bringing up the tax scheme herself, thinking she could use the threat of exposing George to force me to back down. She called me, screaming, "I know about the offshore money, Brenda. If you push this, I'll expose George." I simply hung up, knowing her threat was empty. I held the only evidence needed to prove the fraud, and she knew she couldn't access that money without handing the government the necessary information to ruin all of us. The power was entirely mine. The legal action initiated by Ms. Hayes forced a mandatory deposition. This was the first time Shelley and Pat had to face me outside of the house, under oath, and without the comforting shield of their supposed ownership. Shelley was furious, but also visibly terrified. Pat was just aggressive. Ms. Hayes was masterful. She didn't lead with the forged documents. She started with the house. She presented my shadow ledger, page after page of dated, verifiable records proving every single house payment, every major repair, and every large financial deposit came directly from my separate accounts. She laid out the proof that the house was legally mine from a financial standpoint, completely overriding the intent of George's outdated will. When Pat tried to interrupt, claiming I was too old to remember these details, Ms. Hayes cut her off. Ms. Vance's memory is perfectly clear, as evidenced by this meticulous 40-year financial record. Can your client provide a single document showing contribution to this specific asset, Mr. Finch? Mr. Finch, Shelley's slimy lawyer, had no answer. Then came the climax. Ms. Hayes produced the forged legal letters Shelley had sent me. She looked Shelley in the eye and asked, "Miss Shelley, did you personally forge the signature of George Vance on this document, attempting to fraudulently gain access to Miss Vance's personal accounts while she was grieving?" Shelley looked sick. She glanced desperately at Pat, but Pat could offer no help. Under the pressure of the oath, Shelley stammered, then quietly admitted that she had manipulated George's signature. The courtroom immediately felt locked down. Ms. Hayes paused, let the admission hang in the air, and then executed the final step of my plan. She used the threat of the tax scheme. Ms. Hayes stated, in front of the court, that if Shelley did not immediately agree to vacate the house and sign an affidavit relinquishing all claims to the assets, we would be forced to disclose evidence of significant intentional tax evasion related to George's offshore accounts, which Shelley was actively attempting to exploit. The threat was enough. Shelley and Pat knew I had the bomb. Shelley and Pat were completely defeated. The admission of forgery and the looming threat of a federal investigation into George's tax loophole, which would ruin George's legacy and potentially implicate them, left them without any options. They finally realized the quiet, confused old woman they had mocked held all the power. Miss Hayes quickly negotiated the final settlement: immediate vacating of the house. Shelley and Pat had 48 hours to leave the premises. Relinquishment of all claims. They had to formally sign documents giving up all rights to the house, the retirement funds, and any offshore investments. Payment of legal fees. Shelley was forced to agree to pay the entirety of my legal fees, which, thanks to Ms. Hayes' work, were substantial. I did not seek a single penny of Shelley's personal money beyond covering my costs. My revenge was not about financial gain. It was about protecting my home and my peace. Victor, in his arrogance, was trapped. 48 hours later, Shelley and Pat were packing. I stood quietly at the kitchen window, watching them load their tacky belongings into a rental truck. They glared at the house, defeated and angry. I had won the full victory. The house was mine, the inheritance was secure for its intended purpose, and Shelley was left with the humiliation of defeat and a mountain of legal debt. The ultimate irony? They came to steal my house because they thought I was old and incompetent, and I used my meticulous old-school competence to ensure they left with nothing but shame. The eviction was the sweet, quiet culmination of months of patient work. Pat and Shelley didn't leave quietly. They stormed out, slamming doors and leaving behind mountains of unnecessary clutter. The neighbors, the people Shelley and Pat had gossiped to, claiming I was mentally failing, came out onto their porches to watch them leave. The sight of the defeated pair loading their belongings into a dingy U-Haul truck while I stood calmly on my porch was the final, satisfying act of public justice. As soon as they were gone, I changed all the locks. I didn't rush. I cleaned the house meticulously, scrubbing away the feeling of invasion. I took everything Shelley and Pat had brought in, the tacky new decorative items, the cheap cleaning products, and threw them straight into the garbage. I restored George's office, filing away the decoy documents and locking my master file, the bomb, back into its secure spot in the sewing machine cabinet. The legal threat was gone, but the knowledge that I had the power to expose George's tax secrets remained a silent, permanent shield. Shelley's financial ruin was swift and decisive. The legal fees she was ordered to pay were crippling, especially since she had no steady income. The revenge was poetic. She came to seize wealth she didn't earn, and she left with a debt she couldn't afford. I had protected George's name from federal prosecution while simultaneously delivering the maximal possible ruin to the person who tried to exploit his legacy. My home was quiet again. My peace was restored. I was 70, and I had just won the greatest legal battle of my life, all without raising my voice or showing a single tear. 6 months passed, and the peace of my home was absolute. The house truly felt like mine again, filled with the warmth of my own successful effort. I spent time in my sewing room, not working on fabrics, but reviewing the shadow ledger one last time. I filed it away, my safety net, my proof, my quiet victory. I decided to take the money George had intended for us, the money I had fought so hard to protect, and use it exactly as we had planned, securing my retirement. I funded a new secure trust under my name, ensuring that my future was completely independent and unassailable. I reflected on George. He was a good husband, but he underestimated me, both professionally and personally. He never wanted me to worry about messy details, but those messy details were what saved my entire life. They saved his legacy, too, because I was the one who kept the truth hidden. The revenge against Shelley wasn't just about winning a lawsuit. It was about proving that my worth was not determined by my age or my title as wife. My worth was in my meticulousness, my patience, and my ability to follow the rules of a game only I truly understood. I closed the sewing cabinet, locking the master file safely away. The house was clean, the garden was blooming, and the silence was now a warm, comforting blanket of independence. I looked at George's framed photograph on the mantelpiece, smiled, and whispered, "I found the papers, George, and I won." I was 70 years old, retired, and richer in spirit and finance than I had ever been. Never too old to handle the difficult things.